A widow. A man burdened with buried grief. A freezing winter night that could kill both of them. When Elena Cross knocks on Colton Mercer's farmhouse door at midnight, she doesn't ask for money, she doesn't ask for food. She only asks to work. He sends her away. But when he finds her collapsed in the snow, his conscience won't let him leave. A decision that night, both reckless and compassionate, will forever change everything he thought he had lost. Like to support the channel. Comment the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed, and follow so you don't miss the next part. The story begins now. The snow had been falling since before sundown, and by midnight it was the kind of storm that made Montana feel like the edge of the earth. Colton Mercer stood at the window of his front room with a lantern in one hand and his dead wife's shawl draped over the back of the chair behind him, because he still hadn't been able to move it to anywhere else. The shawl had been there since September. It was December now. He'd stopped counting the exact days somewhere around mid-October, when counting started to feel like a kind of punishment he hadn't earned but couldn't stop inflicting on himself. The baby was asleep in the back room. That was the only mercy the night had offered. Colton set the lantern on the sill and watched the snow come down in sheets, bending the bare cottonwoods along the fence line into shapes that looked almost human in the dark. He'd been awake since 2 the previous morning. He couldn't say why exactly, except that sleep had become a stranger to him, something other men had access to, men whose wives were still breathing. He was 34 years old. He felt 60. He'd just turned from the window when the knock came. Not a pounding, not the frantic hammering of someone in genuine panic. Just 3 measured strikes against the door. Deliberate, like whoever was on the other side had thought carefully about whether to knock at all and had finally decided they had no other choice. He stood still for a moment, listening. The wind howled. The knock came again. Colton picked up the lantern and the rifle he kept beside the door. Not because he was a violent man, but because 1871 in Montana Territory had a way of teaching even gentlemen to keep their options close. And he opened the door. She was standing about 2 feet back from the threshold, like she'd been careful not to crowd him. That detail he noticed right away. She was young, maybe 25, maybe a hard-lived 22, her coat soaked through with snow and her dark hair frozen in strands against her cheek. She was carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder and a bedroll strapped to her back that looked like it had seen better years. Her boots were the wrong kind for this weather, thin-soled, meant for somewhere milder. Her lips had gone that bad shade of blue that came right before worse things happened. But she was standing straight, both feet planted, eyes clear. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, before he could open his mouth. Her voice was hoarser than it should have been. Wind damage, or cold damage, or both. "I heard you're a man running a ranch short-handed. I can cook, mend fences, work cattle, keep ledgers if you need it. I'll sleep in the barn if there's space. I'm asking for work, not a handout." Colton looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light made the snow around her look almost yellow. "Where'd you come from?" he said. "Billings, most recently. Before that, further east." "You walked from Billings in this?" "I had a horse until 2 days ago." She didn't say what happened to the horse, and something in the way she didn't say it made him decide not to ask. He looked past her into the dark. The snow was coming harder now. There was no shelter in sight. The nearest homestead was the Gallagher's, 4 miles east, and that was across open ground that would kill a person without proper gear before they made it halfway. He looked back at her face. She hadn't flinched under his examination, hadn't smiled at him, or tried to soften whatever she saw in his expression. She just waited. "I'm not in a position to take on help right now," he said. Something shifted in her eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like the expression of someone who'd been told this particular thing a number of times and had gotten practiced at receiving it. "All right," she said. She adjusted the strap of her bag. "Thank you for opening the door." She turned and walked back into the storm. Colton stood in the open doorway and watched her go. The snow swallowed her outline in about 30 seconds. He stood there another 30 seconds after that, the cold coming in around him, and then he shut the door and went back to his chair. He sat down. He looked at his wife's shawl. He was back out the door in 4 minutes. He found her about 60 yards from the house, down on one knee in the snow with her hand braced against a fence post, and for a terrible second he thought she was already gone. But when he got close enough to touch her shoulder, she lifted her head, and her eyes were still tracking him, still sharp even through whatever her body was doing to her. "Get up," he said. He wasn't gentle about it. There wasn't time for gentle. He pulled her arm over his shoulders and got her upright, and she didn't fight him, which told him she was closer to the edge than she wanted him to know. "I told you I didn't need charity," she said. Her teeth were chattering so hard the words came out fractured. "This isn't charity," he said, hauling her through the snow back toward the house. "This is me not wanting to dig a grave in frozen ground." She didn't say anything to that. He got her inside and put her in front of the fireplace. She didn't collapse dramatically. She sat down on the floor in front of the fire with the specific careful movement of someone trying to manage their own limitations without making a scene of it, and she held her hands out toward the heat, and she didn't say anything at all for a while. Colton went to the kitchen and put water on the stove. He found the last of the dried beef he'd been meaning to make into stew and cut some of it into a tin pot with an onion and some winter parsnips. He worked without speaking. From the other room, he could hear the wet sound of her coat hitting the floor as she took it off, and then nothing but the fire. When he brought the cup of coffee in, real coffee, not the chicory substitute most people were using that winter, she looked up at him with an expression that was harder to read than he expected. Not gratitude, exactly. Something more complicated than that. "You had enough reason to leave me out there," she said. "Maybe." He set the cup down on the floor near her and went back to the kitchen. Soup in about 20 minutes. Her name was Elena Cross. She told him that much while she ate, sitting at his kitchen table in a borrowed wool shirt that had been his wife's, which was the only dry thing he had that might fit her, and which he'd handed over without thinking too hard about it, and then spent the better part of dinner trying not to think about it all. She was tidier about eating than he expected. Took small, careful bites. Didn't rush, even though she was clearly hungry enough to have justified rushing. She didn't volunteer much. He didn't push. That was fine. He wasn't much for talking himself. The baby woke up about an hour after she arrived, that particular cry that meant hunger rather than discomfort or loneliness, and Colton pushed back from the table and went to get him. When he came back with the infant balanced against his shoulder and a bottle of the goat's milk he'd been warming by the fire, Elena Cross had started quietly washing the dishes. She turned when she heard him come in and looked at the baby with the kind of expression people have when they're trying to be neutral and aren't quite making it. "How old?" she said. 4 months? He sat down with the baby and offered him the bottle. "His name's Thomas." She nodded and turned back to the dishes. "His mother," Colton started and then stopped. "You don't have to explain anything," Elena said without turning around. "I can see enough." He sat there with his son and the fire and the sound of the storm working on the walls of the house, and for the first time in months, the kitchen didn't feel like a place designed specifically to remind him of everything that was gone from it. In the morning, he told her he'd give her a week's trial. She shook her head. 2 weeks, she said. "A week isn't enough time for either of us to know if this arrangement makes sense. Give it 2 weeks, and if you want me gone, I'll go without argument." He looked at her. "All right," he said. 2 weeks." She put out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and direct. The handshake of someone who meant what they said and expected the same back. The Mercer Ranch had once been a working operation. 300 head of cattle, 2 hired hands, a kitchen garden that his wife Agnes had kept in rigorous shape from May through October. But Agnes had gone in September of childbed fever, 3 days after Thomas was born. One of the hands, a young Swede named Gustafsson, had left 2 weeks after that to take a job in Wyoming that paid more reliably. The other, an older man named Pickett, who'd been with Colton since the beginning, had stayed through October and then caught a lung inflammation that had put him in the ground by November, which left Colton with 300 cattle, a 4-month-old infant, and a ranch that had started falling apart in small ways that were becoming large ways at a rate he couldn't keep up with. Elena saw all of this in the first 2 days without being told any of it. She didn't announce what she was going to do. She just started doing it. The first morning she was up before him. He came out to find the fire already built up, coffee made. Thomas fed and drowsy in the crib with some kind of cloth toy she'd fashioned from scraps in the mending basket. By the time he'd had his coffee, she'd already been to the barn and back with an itemized list of what needed immediate attention versus what could wait until spring. It was written in a neat, precise hand on the back of an old feed invoice she'd found nailed to the barn wall. He looked at the list. Then he looked at her. "You said you could keep ledgers," he said. "I can do that too." She went back to the barn and he stood in the kitchen with the list and tried to figure out what he was supposed to do with the fact that a stranger he'd nearly left to freeze in his front yard had apparently assessed his failing ranch more efficiently in 2 days than he'd managed to do in 3 months of drowning in it. The fence line on the north pasture had been sagging since early November. Colton had been meaning to get to it. Elena got to it on day 3. He came out to find her in the cold with a post hole digger and a bucket of new fence staples she'd apparently located in the tack room under a pile of old harness. "The ground's frozen," he said. 6 inches down it is. First 6 inches I can work with." She drove the digger in again. "The cattle are pressing on the weak sections. If the line goes in a storm, they'll scatter and you won't get them all back." He stood there for a moment, watching her work. Then he went and got the other post hole digger. They worked the fence line through the afternoon without much talking, and somewhere around the midpoint, Colton realized it was the first time in months he'd done sustained physical work alongside another person, and that there was something about it. Not the work itself, but the shared rhythm of it. The small, practical adjustments you made when you were working near someone that was less painful than he'd expected. He didn't say that. He drove another fence post and stamped the frozen dirt around its base and moved on to the next one. Thomas liked her. This was the thing that Colton found hardest to account for, and the thing that stuck with him most when he lay awake in the hours before dawn thinking about the situation he'd gotten himself into. Thomas was a difficult infant. He'd been colicky for his first 2 months, and even now that he'd evened out some, he was particular about who handled him. He tolerated Colton with the specific, resigned acceptance of someone who understood that the available option was the available option, but he'd screamed bloody murder the 2 times a neighbor woman had offered to help out. He did not scream at Elena. Colton had watched it happen and couldn't fully explain it. She didn't coo at this baby or make the exaggerated faces that women sometimes made at infants, in that performative way he'd always found slightly alarming. She just talked to him like he was a person who happened to be very small and not yet verbal. She'd narrate what she was doing. "I'm going to pick you up now. This water's a little warm. Let me fix that. Your father left the good blanket in the other room. We'll get it in a minute." In a steady, matter-of-fact voice, and Thomas would track her face with his eyes with the expression of someone listening to something interesting. On the 4th morning, Colton came into the kitchen to find her sitting at the table with Thomas propped against her arm, both of them apparently examining something outside the window. He stopped in the doorway. "There's a fox," Elena said without turning. "It's been sitting on the fence post for about 10 minutes. Thomas seems to find it interesting." Colton came and looked, and there was, in fact, a red fox sitting on the fence post with the self-important air of a creature who considered this its territory and not the other way around. Thomas made a sound that wasn't quite a word yet, but was clearly aimed at the fox. "He'll be talking by summer," Elena said. "Probably sooner. He watches everything." "Did you have—" Colton started and then stopped. "Children?" She didn't look at him. "No. The fox regarded them through the window for another moment and then descended from its post with great dignity and disappeared into the scrub. Bunk. The rumors started, as far as Colton could track it, sometime around the end of the 2nd week. He heard it first at the feed store, where a man named Darvish, who had the particular gift of making ordinary conversation feel like an accusation, mentioned that folks were wondering about the woman out at the Mercer place. Was she a relation? A widow Colton was being charitable to? Or was it a different kind of arrangement? Colton said she was hired help, which was true, and left without buying the additional supplies he'd come for because he didn't trust what he might say if Darvish kept going. He didn't tell Elena. He should have. He knew that later. She found out through other channels, from the wife of the man who delivered mail, who had apparently stopped being subtle about her opinions when she came out to the ranch one afternoon while Colton was in the far pasture and said something to Elena directly that Colton never got the complete version of, because Elena would only give him a partial account. She was concerned, Elena said when she told him about it that evening. Her voice was flat in the specific way of someone who was being careful about their tone. Concerned about what? About appearances. About your reputation. She was mending a split seam on the work gloves and she didn't look up from her needle. About what people would think. A woman living here who isn't family. Colton set down his cup. What did you tell her? I told her she didn't need to worry about it. There was something in the way she said it that he should have caught sooner. He didn't. He woke up 3 days later and she was gone. Not fled in the night. She'd been orderly about it. Her bedroll, her canvas bag. She'd washed the breakfast dishes before she left, which for some reason made it worse. And she'd left a note on the table in her precise handwriting that said she appreciated the work and wished him well, and that Thomas was due for his next feeding at 8, and there was goat's milk warming by the fire. There was nothing else in the note. Colton sat at the kitchen table for about 5 minutes, which was not his longest deliberation on record, and then he read the letter one more time, and then he went to the back room where Thomas was asleep and looked at his son. Thomas was on his back with his fists curled up near his face, breathing in the specific heavy way of infants deeply asleep. He'd started sleeping through most of the night in the past 2 weeks. He'd started doing this, Colton realized, since Elena had arrived. Before her, he'd been up twice a night, sometimes 3 times, with the inconsolable crying that Colton didn't know how to address, and that made him feel, in the worst of the dark hours, like a man completely without the equipment required for the task in front of him. He went to the barn and saddled his horse. The storm hit while he was still 3 miles out from town. It came from the northwest with the particular speed of Montana winter, which gave no warnings a man could rely on and cared nothing at all about schedules or plans. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in what felt like 20 minutes, and the wind started throwing snow horizontally in a way that cut visibility down to about 15 feet. Colton kept going. He wasn't thinking very clearly, which he was aware of but couldn't seem to do anything about. He was thinking about the fence line they'd fixed together. He was thinking about Thomas tracking the fox through the window. He was thinking about the way she'd shaken his hand that first morning, the directness of it, no performance, just intention, and how he hadn't met someone like that in a long time, and how he'd let the Darvishes of the world take her from his house without even fighting for it. He found her at the edge of town, at the livery stable, trying to make an arrangement for a horse she couldn't actually afford. She turned when she heard him come in, snow-covered and cold-faced, and for just a moment he saw something move across her expression that she put away quickly. "Your son needs feeding," Colton said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I left milk warming. He needs feeding at 10 too, and noon, and 3 in the afternoon." He dismounted. His hands were so cold he had trouble with the reins. "And there are 20 cows with no one to check them in this weather, and the north fence post third from the corner is going to go if it gets hit hard enough. And He stopped. Elena was watching him. "I don't know how to do this without help," he said. He hadn't planned to say it that plainly, but it was out now. "I've been pretending I do for 3 months and I'm not doing it. And what Darvish or anyone else thinks about who's living in my house is—" He shook his head. "It isn't more important than the truth of what's actually happening." She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want to be the reason your name gets dragged through something," she said. "Then marry me," he said. The livery owner, who had been pretending to be very busy with a harness in the corner, went very still. Elena stared at him. "That is not a romantic proposal," she said at last. "No," he agreed. "It's a practical one. We're not those kinds of people. But it solves the problem, and I mean it, and—" He stopped again, started over. "I mean it," he said again, simpler this time. "Not just because of Thomas or the ranch or what people say. I mean it because the house was colder for 3 days than it's been all winter, and that matters to me, whatever that means." He was aware of how bad he was at this. Agnes had once told him that his feelings traveled from his heart to his face by way of a very long, indirect route, and she hadn't been wrong. Elena looked at him for what felt like a considerable amount of time. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. "If we've gotten through the winter and we still want to, ask me in the spring." "All right," he said. "Come inside," she said. "You're freezing. You have to come back first." She looked at him again. Then she went and picked up her canvas bag from the corner of the stable where she'd set it down. "I'm coming back," she said. They rode home through the storm, side by side, not talking. The snow was bad enough that they had to go slowly and trust the horses to know the ground better than they did. At some point, Elena reached over and adjusted his grip on the reins. His hands were half numb, and he'd let the tension go slack without noticing. She did it matter-of-factly, without comment. He let her. The house was cold when they got back, but not as cold as it had been the 3 days she was gone, which didn't make sense logically, but felt true all the same. He put more wood on the fire while she checked on Thomas. He heard her voice in the back room, low and steady, narrating whatever she was seeing, the particular way she had of talking to his son that assumed the boy was worth being talked to. He sat down by the fire. He didn't pick up his wife's shawl, but he didn't move it either. For now, that was the best he could do, and it was enough. Outside, the storm worked on the walls of the house, and the walls held. The spring proposal didn't happen the way Colton had imagined it, which was probably appropriate given that nothing about the preceding months had gone the way anyone would have planned. What happened instead was this. It was late February, the worst of the cold finally beginning to break in the way that Montana winter broke. Not warmly, not with any particular mercy, but with a grudging, incremental loosening of grip. And Elena was at the kitchen table going through the ranch ledgers with the stub of pencil and the focused expression she got when numbers weren't adding up the way she wanted them to. Thomas was on the floor between them, in the arrangement of blankets and propped cushions that had become his preferred territory for the alert hours of his day, batting at a wooden ring Colton had whittled for him sometime in January. Colton was watching his son watch his hands, and he was also watching Elena without being particularly subtle about it, which she was aware of and ignoring. "You're staring," she said without looking up. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About whether you'd consider not waiting until spring." She looked up then. She had a smear of pencil lead on the side of her hand from where she'd been resting it on the page. "It's February," she said. "Close enough." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back down at the ledger. "The cattle are going to need—" "Elena." She stopped. He said, "I'm not going to pretend I'm good at this. You know I'm not, but I know what I mean, and I mean it. And I'd rather say it in February than lose 3 more months wondering if I've already said the wrong thing." The fire crackled. Thomas dropped his wooden ring and made a noise of mild complaint. Elena reached down without looking, picked up the ring, and handed it back to him. Then she closed the ledger. "All right," she said. "All right, yes. Or all right, you've heard me. All right, yes." She opened the ledger again. "Now let me finish these accounts. We're short on the spring seed budget, and I need to figure out where it's coming from." He sat back. There was something that wanted to be a smile working at the corner of his mouth, and he let it stay there without commenting on it. Thomas threw the ring again. Turtle. They were married in the first week of March by the circuit judge who came through the territory every 6 weeks. In the front room of the house with Thomas present in his crib and no other witnesses except the judge's clerk, a thin young man named Ord who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and signed the paper with the harassed efficiency of someone processing paperwork rather than witnessing a life event. Elena wore her better dress, which was blue wool and had a small tear at the left cuff that she'd mended neatly enough that you had to look for it. Colton wore his good shirt, which Agnes had ironed for the last time 18 months ago, and which he'd kept in the drawer since then because wearing it seemed like it would mean something he wasn't ready for it to mean. He wore it now. The judge said the necessary words, and they said the necessary words back. And when it was done, Elena Cross became Elena Mercer in the eyes of whatever law applied to this particular stretch of territory, and Colton shook the judge's hand and the judge's clerk signed the paper and left before the ink was fully dry. They stood in the front room in the quiet after. "Well," Elena said. "Well," Colton said. Thomas made a sound from his crib that communicated with some urgency that he had opinions about the direction of the day and that those opinions centered primarily on hunger. Elena went to get him, and Colton stood by the window looking out at the yard where the last of the winter snow was going gray and soft at the edges. And he thought about Agnes and about what it meant to move forward without it being a betrayal of what came before. And he didn't arrive at any clear answer. But he thought he was maybe asking the right question, which was more than he'd been doing for a while. Spring came in on its own terms, which in Montana meant mud season first, a period of approximately 6 weeks where the ground turned to something between solid and liquid, and the cattle found new and creative ways to get themselves stuck in it. And every trip to the barn and back left boot prints 3 inches deep in the yard. Elena attacked mud season the way she attacked everything, which was practically and without sentiment. She rigged a plank walkway from the house to the barn using boards she'd located in the storage shed and rope she'd repurposed from old hay baling tackle. She got Thomas a pair of rubber boots 2 sizes too large that he clomped around in with immense satisfaction. She started the kitchen garden a full 2 weeks earlier than Colton would have, starting seedlings inside on the south-facing windowsill, rows of small clay pots that she'd made herself from the red clay by the creek bed. He'd watched her make the pots one afternoon, her hands working the clay with a focused efficiency that suggested she'd done it before. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "My mother," she said. She didn't look up. She was practical about things. Didn't see the point in buying what you could make. It was the most she'd said about her family in the months she'd been there. He filed it away, the way he'd filed other small things. The fact that she flinched at sudden loud noises, that she always knew where the exits were in a room, that she checked the door lock before bed with the automatic regularity of someone who had specific reasons for that habit. He didn't ask. She'd tell him what she wanted to tell him when she wanted to tell it. By April, the ranch was running better than it had in a year. This was not a small statement. Colton had built the Mercer spread from a modest claim into a working operation over 7 years, and he knew its rhythms, its weaknesses, its seasonal demands. But knowing what a thing needs and having the capacity to provide it were different categories, and the 18 months before Elena arrived had eroded that capacity considerably. She had restored it in 3 months, not by magic and not without friction. There were mornings they disagreed about the cattle rotation, and neither of them was the type to back down quickly from a position they'd reasoned themselves into. There was a week in March where she'd reorganized the tack room in a way that made complete sense to her, and no sense to him until she explained it, and his pride had taken several days to concede the point. There was a particular argument about the kitchen garden fence. He wanted it higher. She said the height was fine, and the issue was the soil composition. That lasted 3 days and ended with them both being partially right, which was probably the most honest outcome available. But the cattle were healthy, the accounts were balanced, the hay stores had stretched through the winter without the shortfall he'd been dreading. And Thomas at 6 months was a solid, dark-eyed, observant creature who had developed strong opinions about who he wanted holding him, and strong opinions about the wooden ring, and strong opinions about the red fox who had apparently taken up semi-permanent residence on the fence post, and whom Thomas now addressed with a proprietary familiarity that suggested he considered the fox a household member. Elena called the fox Aldous. Colton had not authorized this naming and was pretending it hadn't happened, but he noticed that he'd started checking for the fox in the mornings when he went to the barn. The trouble with the settlement was quieter for a while, but it didn't disappear. Colton had thought, maybe naively, that the marriage would settle the question, that the legal fact of it would give the Darvishes of the world less to work with. And for the coldest weeks of late winter, it had seemed like maybe that was true. People had their own problems in February in Montana, but spring brought people out, and people out meant people talking, and what they were talking about. What reached him in pieces through the feed store and the dry goods counter and the particular telegraph of small community information was Elena herself. Not the fact of her presence anymore, but the nature of it. She was too capable, apparently. Too confident. She spoke directly to men in the street when she had business with them, didn't wait to be addressed. She'd gone to the feed store herself one morning in April, while Colton was occupied with a difficult birth in the cattle herd, and she'd negotiated the price of a 100-pound order of spring seed down by 12%, which the store owner, a man named Haverfield, had apparently found objectionable enough to mention to 3 other people. She'd repaired the north section of fence line that bordered the Gallagher property with such thoroughness that Mac Gallagher had come over to see who Colton had hired. And when he'd found out it was Elena, he'd gone back home and apparently told his wife something that his wife had told someone else. People didn't know what to do with her. That was the core of it, as far as Colton could see. She didn't fit into the categories they had available. She wasn't a helpless widow they could assist. She wasn't a hired man. She wasn't the kind of wife who made herself invisible. She was something they didn't have a word for that sat right, and the absence of a word made them uneasy, and unease in small communities had a way of becoming something uglier over time. He told her some of this one evening. Not all of it. He edited it down to the parts that seemed actionable. Elena listened. She was feeding Thomas his last bottle of the evening, the baby's eyes getting heavy, and she didn't change her expression during the telling. "Do you want me to be different?" she said when he'd finished. "No." "Then I'm not sure what the concern is." "I'm not concerned," he said. "I'm telling you what's being said so you're not surprised by it." She looked at him. "I'm not surprised by it. I've been surprised by very little in this area my entire life." She shifted Thomas to her shoulder, rubbing his back. "People say things. They keep saying them until something more interesting comes along, and then they say that instead. What matters is whether it affects what we're trying to do here." "It might?" "Well." She got Thomas settled against her and looked back at Colton with an expression that was not dismissive exactly, but was practical in the way that could look like dismissal if you weren't reading it carefully. "Then we deal with it when it does." The thing that finally lit the situation into something Colton couldn't manage quietly arrived on a Thursday in early May, in the form of a delegation. He used that word for it later, privately, because it was the politest word he could find. What it actually was 3 women from the settlement: Mrs. Harwick, whose husband owned the mill; Mrs. Darvish, whose husband Colton already had specific feelings about; and a woman named Polly Rudd, who seemed to have come along mostly to witness, who arrived at the ranch in a buggy on Thursday morning while Colton was out moving cattle to the spring pasture. Elena was alone in the yard, fixing a split board on the chicken coop, when they arrived. She told him about it that evening, standing at the kitchen stove, her voice careful and level. "Mrs. Harwick said they'd come to offer their support," Elena said. She turned the pan. She said the community was concerned about what kind of environment Thomas was being raised in. Colton set down his fork. "She said," Elena continued, "that a woman who had come from nowhere with no references, no family anyone could account for, was perhaps not the most suitable influence on a child." She paused. She was polite about it. That's almost more impressive from a technical standpoint. She was genuinely polite while saying a genuinely ugly thing. "What did you say?" "I asked if she wanted to come inside and see the child in question and make her own assessment." Elena moved the pan off the heat. "She declined. She said they were just passing on the community's concern." "The community," Colton said, in a tone that did not reflect warmth toward the community. "She also said—" Elena stopped. "What?" "She said it wasn't too late to make a different arrangement. If I were to go back where I came from, the ranch would qualify for one of the widow assistance programs through the county, and there were several respectable women in the settlement who would be glad to—" "Enough," Colton said. She turned from the stove. She was doing the thing she did when she was controlling her reaction, keeping her face neutral, keeping her hands occupied, keeping the rhythm of whatever task she was at steady. He'd learned to read this the way he'd learned to read the sky for weather. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not defensive, just factual." "I know that." He stood up from the table. "I'm going to talk to Harwick." "Colton." He stopped. "Don't do it angry," she said. "Angry doesn't help. They have to decide on their own that they're wrong. You can't make them decide it by shouting it at them." She picked up the pan again. "Give it time." He stood there for a moment, the anger doing what anger does in a body, looking for somewhere to go, finding nowhere suitable. "They came to my house," he said. "I know. They came to my house and said that about my wife and my son." "I know," Elena said again. "Come eat. The food's going cold." He sat back down. He picked up his fork. He did not particularly taste the food. 3 days after the delegation visit, Mac Gallagher's wife Bess came over. Not in a group. Alone, on foot, which meant she'd walk the 4 miles from the Gallagher place, because Mac apparently had the horse out, and Bess had decided the walk was worth it. Elena was in the garden when Bess arrived, on her knees between the rows with a hand trowel. Colton was nearby, splitting wood, and he stopped when he saw Bess come through the gate, stopped with the axe half raised, watching, because the last thing he wanted was another version of Thursday. Bess Gallagher was 60, or somewhere near it, and she'd been on the frontier since she was 20, and she looked like it in the good way, weathered and solid and not particularly interested in softening herself for anyone. She'd delivered 3 of her own children without a doctor present, and she'd buried 2 of them the same way, and whatever that experience had made her, it was nothing fragile. She walked up to where Elena was kneeling in the garden and stood over her for a moment, looking down. "That's good spacing on the beans," Bess said. Elena looked up. "I did them about 8 inches. Soil's richer on this end, so they might crowd anyway." "Probably." Bess crouched down, not gracefully, but without embarrassment about it, and took a fistful of soil and looked at it. "Good tilth, you've been working it." "Since March." Bess put the soil down and brushed her hands on her apron. "I heard what Harwick's wife said to you. News travels." "It does around here." Bess looked at her squarely. "I want you to know I didn't send them, and I didn't agree with them, and I told my husband as much, and he told me to keep out of it, and I told him that when a woman does a thing worth speaking well of, somebody ought to speak well of it." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," she said. "What thing are you speaking well of?" Bess almost smiled. "That fence line between our properties. Mac's been meaning to fix that fence for 4 years. You did it in an afternoon. It needed doing. So does a lot of things. Most people wait until they can't avoid it." Bess got herself upright with the careful effort of someone whose knees had opinions about cold mornings. "I'm not saying people around here are going to come around quick. Mostly they won't. But they'll notice what's in front of them if it's there long enough. And what's in front of them here is a woman who works, and a ranch that's running, and a child who looks well." She looked at Elena straight. That counts for something, even when people pretend it doesn't. From across the yard, Colton had lowered his axe. He was watching, and he wasn't sure what he was feeling exactly, but part of it was something close to relief. The particular kind that came from knowing you weren't entirely alone in a position you'd thought might be a solitary one. Elena stood up from the garden. She put out her hand to Bess Gallagher. Bess shook it the same way Elena shook hands, directly, without performance. "Come inside," Elena said. "I have coffee on." Through May and into June, the ranch grew into its best season in 2 years. The cattle filled out well on the spring grass. The kitchen garden came up in thick, disciplined rows. Beans, squash, the last of the winter root vegetables being replaced by summer plantings. And the tomatoes that Elena had started inside in March, now setting fruit against the south wall. The ledgers balanced. The hay fields were cut twice by midsummer, and the second cutting went into the barn with enough additional room that Colton let himself think, for the first time in a while, about expanding the herd the following spring. Thomas learned to sit without support on a Tuesday in May, and made such an event of it, regarding his own accomplishment with the grave satisfaction of someone who had solved a meaningful problem, that Elena came to get Colton from the barn just so he wouldn't miss it. He came in with his hands not quite clean and sat on the floor near his son, and Thomas sat there between them with his fists on his knees, looking from one face to the other like he was running a quiet inventory. "He's going to be serious," Elena said. His mother was serious. She looked at him. He'd mentioned Agnes directly maybe 3 times since the winter, always carefully, like handling something that required specific attention to temperature. "What was she like?" Elena asked. He thought about it for a moment. "Funnier than she looked," he said. "People underestimated her because she was quiet. She used to let them, and then she'd say something that cut right to the center of a thing, and they'd be surprised, and she'd never let on that she'd known exactly what she was doing." He paused. "Thomas has her eyes." "He does," Elena said. "That's all right," Colton said. "I want him to have her eyes." She didn't say anything to that. She reached over and straightened Thomas's collar, which had gone crooked, and Thomas grabbed her finger and held on with the focused grip of a child conducting important research. The problem arrived in June, in a different form than the delegation, and harder to manage. It started with a boy named Cade Rudd, Polly Rudd's son, 17 years old, who had apparently decided that Elena's reputation was fair territory for the specific cruelty that adolescent boys were capable of when they had an audience and a target, and not enough sense to understand the distance between those two things and actual courage. He'd been at it for a few weeks in small ways, comments loud enough to be heard in the street when Elena came to town, a broken fence post on the ranch road that might have been accident and might not. Colton hadn't been able to prove the fence post, and Elena had told him to let the comments go. But the June incident was harder to let go. Elena had been at the dry goods store picking up thread and some additional seed, And Cade Rudd was there with two of his friends, and whatever he said, Elena didn't repeat it to Colton verbatim, and he didn't press her on it. It was apparently specific enough and loud enough that three other people in the store heard it, and nobody said anything. She walked out of the store and came home and put away the thread and the seed and started making dinner, and she didn't tell Colton about it until after he asked why she'd come back from town in less time than the errand should have taken. When she finished telling him, she was very still in the way that she got very still when something had gotten to her that she didn't want to show. He sat with it for a moment. "I'm going to talk to Polly Rudd," he said. "She can't control what her son does. She can try harder than she apparently has been." He pushed back from the table. "And I'm going to talk to Cade directly." "Colton, I'm not going to shout at him," he said. "I'm going to have a conversation, a clear one." He looked at her. "Nobody gets to do that. Not in my town, not to my wife, not in front of people who should know better than to stand there and say nothing." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "Don't make it worse," she said. "I'll do my best," he said, which was honest but perhaps not as reassuring as she wanted. He did not shout at Cade Rudd. He found the boy the following morning at the livery where Cade did some work on Saturdays, and he spoke to him in a tone that was quiet and specific, and had the effect, he thought, of getting through in a way that shouting wouldn't have. He didn't make threats. He explained consequences in the concrete way of a man who'd spent years managing things that required precision rather than drama. Cade Rudd was 17 and wanted to look unimpressed, but something in his face shifted partway through. Colton also spoke to Haverfield at the feed store, not accusatorially but directly, about what it meant when people in a community watched something happen and didn't say anything. Haverfield had the grace to look uncomfortable. Neither conversation fixed everything. That was the nature of it. There was no single conversation that fixed everything, no dramatic confrontation that cleared the air and left people changed. What changed was smaller and slower. Cade Rudd stopped being loud in the street. Haverfield nodded to Elena when she came in with something approaching actual respect. Bess Gallagher continued to visit on a semi-regular basis, which was the most reliable thing. And Elena, for her part, kept doing what she'd been doing, working the ranch, keeping the accounts, arguing with Colton about fence heights and cattle rotation and the proper timing for the second hay cut, raising Thomas with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who had decided a thing and was not going to be persuaded out of it by what anyone in any settlement thought about it. Midsummer, Colton came home from the far pasture to find Thomas taking his first crawling steps across the kitchen floor. Unsteady, furious, determined, falling over and getting back up and going again, while Elena sat nearby watching him with her chin in her hand. She heard Colton come in and said without turning, "About an hour ago." He's been at it ever since. Colton crouched down on the floor, and Thomas crawled toward him with the expression of someone who had solved the fundamental problem of locomotion and intended to use it extensively. "He's fast," Colton said. "He's going to be trouble when he figures out the door," Elena said. They sat on the kitchen floor together while his son crawled circles around them, and outside through the window the summer evening came in slow and orange through the cottonwoods, and the fox sat on its fence post watching everything with yellow, judicial eyes, and the kitchen smelled like the beef stew that had been on the stove since noon and would last them 3 days. It was not a perfect life. Colton was still learning, after months, how to talk to Elena about the things that mattered rather than the things that were practical. She still checked the door lock at night with the automatic regularity of old fear. The settlement still had people in it who thought what they thought, and probably always would. The work was hard, and the winters were long, and there was nothing about any of it that was finished. But Thomas was crawling, and the stew was on, and Elena Cross, Elena Mercer, was sitting on his kitchen floor in the orange summer light, watching his son move through the world, and when she turned and caught him looking, she didn't look away. Neither did he. The summer that Thomas learned to crawl was the summer the ranch finally started feeling like something that belonged to both of them. That was the only way Colton could describe it to himself, in the private accounting he did of such things. Not a dramatic shift, not a moment where everything changed, but a gradual settling, the way a new saddle eventually conforms to the shape of use. By July, he'd stopped bracing himself every morning for the specific hollowness that had defined the months after Agnes, that quality of walking into a room and feeling the absence of another person like a change in air pressure. The house still had Agnes in it, in the quilt on the spare bed, in the cast iron pan she'd seasoned until it was nearly black, in Thomas's eyes when the light hit them a certain way. But the house had Elena in it too, and those two things had found a way to coexist that he hadn't been sure was possible. Elena herself seemed, if not content exactly, then at least less braced. The checking of the door lock was still there, but she'd started doing it less like someone guarding against a specific threat and more like habit. She slept through the night most nights, which he knew because the ranch house was small and the walls weren't thick, and he'd spent enough wakeful hours himself to have mapped the sounds of the place. In the early months, she'd been up at 2, 3 in the morning, moving quietly around the kitchen, not disturbed enough to make any noise about it, but not sleeping either. By August, that was happening maybe once a week. They didn't talk about what it meant. That was all right. They were people who communicated better through the daily accumulation of small things than through direct statements. And the small things were going in a direction that didn't need narrating. Thomas got his first tooth in late July and made his feelings about this known at considerable volume. Elena sat up with him 3 nights running while Colton took the early morning shift, and somewhere in the handoff on the 3rd night, in the 3 a.m. kitchen with the baby finally asleep on Elena's shoulder and Colton standing in the doorway half awake, she looked up at him and said very quietly, "I didn't know it would feel like this." "Like what?" he said, equally quiet. She looked at Thomas. "Like he's mine." Colton stood there for a moment. "He is," he said. Simple as that. She didn't say anything else, but something in her face settled in a way he'd been watching for and hadn't been sure he'd ever see. Chap. The storm that changed everything came in September, the kind that arrived without adequate warning, even for people who'd lived in Montana long enough to read weather the way other people read print. It had been a dry August, which should have been a sign. The grass in the far pasture was shorter than it should have been by September's first week, and the cattle had been restless in the particular way they got when something in the air was wrong. Colton had noted it and moved the herd closer to the home pasture as a precaution, which turned out to be the one thing he did right. The storm arrived on a Wednesday evening as a wind shift and was a full crisis by midnight. It wasn't a snowstorm, so that was the thing that surprised him. September was early even for Montana snow. What it was a violent systems collision, the kind that brought sustained wind and driving rain and temperature drops sharp enough to be dangerous for livestock caught in the open. By 10 o'clock, the barn was rattling in a way that made Colton put his boots on and go check it, and what he found when he got there was that the section of roof over the southeast corner, the section he'd been meaning to properly reinforce since spring and had patched instead, had developed a lean that it hadn't had that morning. He came back to the house and told Elena. She was already in her barn coat. "You knew," he said. "I heard the change in the sound," she said, pulling her gloves on. "About 10 minutes ago. I was giving you time to come back and tell me. The southeast corner's going. I need to get the animals out of that section and reinforce the crossbeam if I can. I'll move the cattle, you get the beam. Elena, I know where the animals are, you know where the tools are." She opened the door and the wind came through hard enough to move the curtains across the room. "Don't argue about who should do what. We're short on time." He didn't argue. What happened in the next 2 hours was the kind of work that stripped everything down to its essentials. No conversation, no strategy, just the immediate demands of a situation that didn't accommodate hesitation. Colton got to the southeast crossbeam with a jack and 2 lengths of timber he'd cut for fencing the previous spring, and he worked in the dark with a lantern that kept threatening to go out, the roof above him groaning with each wind gust in a way that was not reassuring. Elena moved the cattle. She'd worked with them enough by now that most of them knew her voice, and she used it steadily. Not loud, not panicked, just the specific calm that cattle responded to when they were frightened and looking for a reason not to be. She got the 12 animals from the southeast section into the main barn corridor, and then she went back in. That was where it went wrong. Colton heard her shout. Not a scream. Elena didn't scream. It was a short, sharp sound of effort and alarm. And then a crash that was the crossbeam he'd been shoring up giving way on the eastern end. And then nothing for 2 seconds that felt considerably longer. He got around the fallen timber in time to see her backed against the far wall with a calf pressed against her legs. The beam had come down across the stall doorway, and a section of the wall above it had followed, and there was burning. He smelled it before he saw it. the particular smell of old dry wood catching from an overturned lantern somewhere in the wreckage. "The calf," Elena said. Her voice was strained. "He's stuck. The board's across his back leg. Elena, there's fire. I know there's fire. Help me get this board." The board in question was a 6-inch oak plank, part of the stall wall, and it had come down across the calf's rear left leg with enough force to pin the animal without breaking it, a matter of inches from a different outcome. The calf was making the low, continuous sound of an animal in pain, but still present, still fighting, and Elena had her hands under the plank trying to lever it. Colton got there and got his shoulder under the far end, and they lifted together, and the calf scrambled free and lurched to the wall, legs unsteady but bearing weight. The fire was small, but it was in dry material, and it was getting larger with the wind coming through the gap in the roof. Colton grabbed the nearest thing, which was a horse blanket, and beat at it while Elena dragged the calf out by its neck, and he got the fire out in the time it took for her to get the animal into the corridor. Then he turned and looked at her. She was holding her right hand away from her body at an angle that was wrong. "Let me see," he said. "It's fine." "Let me see it, Elena." She turned and he looked at her hand in the lantern light, and it was not fine. The burn ran from the base of her thumb to mid-palm. She'd gotten it from the lantern when the beam came down, he pieced together later, the lantern catching against her hand as it fell. The skin was angry red, going to white at the center, in the way that meant it was worse than the surface suggested. "We need to get you inside," he said. "The cattle are in the corridor and not going anywhere. I'll come back for them." He took her by the arm, careful of the hand. "Inside. Now." She didn't fight him this time. He'd been trained in basic wound treatment the way most frontier men were, practically by necessity, by watching other people and doing what they did and praying it was right. He got the burn cleaned with the carbolic he kept in the medicine box and wrapped it with clean linen, and Elena sat at the kitchen table through this with her jaw set and her eyes on the far wall. Thomas was awake, pulled out of sleep by whatever combination of sound and instinct infants had for knowing something was wrong. Elena held him in her uninjured arm while Colton wrapped her hand, and Thomas was unusually still, his dark eyes moving between their faces. "It's not as bad as it looks," Elena said. "The center's deep." He tied off the bandage. "You need the doctor. The doctor is 12 miles and there's a storm." "In the morning, then. When it breaks." "It'll be fine by morning." He looked at her. "Elena." She looked back at him with the expression she used when she'd decided a thing. "I've had worse and kept my hand. I'll keep this one." He sat back. His hands were shaking slightly, which he noticed with some detachment, the aftermath of the last 2 hours working its way out of his system. The barn was intact, damaged but standing, the fire out, the cattle secured. The calf would probably be sore for a week, but was upright. The southeast corner would need proper repair in the morning, and the week after, and probably additional attention before the first snow. All of that was manageable. What was not as manageable was the image that he couldn't get out of his mind. Elena standing against that wall in the smoke, her hand already burned, not moving until the calf was free. "That animal was not worth your hand," he said. "It was a scared calf with a broken leg." It was a scared calf with a pinned leg, which would have freed itself when the board was moved. "We didn't know that yet." "Elena..." "Colton." She shifted Thomas to her other side. "I'm not going to argue about it. I did what was in front of me to do. The calf is fine. My hand is going to be fine. The barn is standing." She looked at him steadily. "It was a bad hour. We got through it. That's the whole story." He wanted to say more. He sat with it for a moment and then let it go, because she was right that it was the whole story, and he'd learned that pressing Elena past the point where she considered a thing settled didn't produce anything useful. "I'm going back out to check the cattle," he said. "I know," she said. "Take the good lantern." The doctor came out in the morning, because Colton went and got him regardless of what Elena had said, and the doctor confirmed what Colton had suspected. The burn was 2nd degree at the center and would need several weeks of careful management and would leave a scar. Elena took this information with the same equanimity she applied to most information she didn't particularly want. "Will she keep full use of it?" Colton asked. "Most likely," the doctor said. He was a practical man named Whitmore, who'd been treating frontier families long enough to dispense with softening his assessments, provided it doesn't get infected and she rests it properly. Define resting it properly, Elena said. Not using it for heavy work for a minimum of 3 weeks. Elena looked at him. 2 weeks, she said. 3, Whitmore said, with the air of a man who had had this specific conversation before. Elena looked at Colton. 3 weeks, Colton said. She looked out the window. The barn repair is going to need both of us. I'll hire Gallagher's oldest boy. He needs the work. She said nothing, which was as close to conceding a point as she generally got. The 3 weeks of enforced reduced activity were not easy on Elena, which was not surprising. She was not a person built for stillness, and watching the barn repair from the kitchen window while young Pete Gallagher and Colton worked it was visibly difficult for her. She channeled the energy into the ledgers, into the planning for the winter stores, into making lists of everything that needed doing and organizing them by priority and timeline in the precise hand that Colton had come to be able to read at a glance. Thomas, for his part, seemed to understand that his role during this period was to be cooperative. He was in a phase of pulling himself upright against any available furniture and standing in place with great satisfaction, and he occupied himself with this extensively, working the circuit of kitchen chairs and table legs and window sills with the focused determination of someone in serious training. It was the end of the second week when the stranger arrived. He came on a gray horse in the mid-afternoon, which was an unremarkable time to arrive, except that there was nothing unremarkable about him. Colton was in the yard when he rode up, a man somewhere in his 40s, lean-faced and wearing a coat that had been better quality before it became weathered, with the particular bearing of someone who had thought carefully about how he carried himself and had specific reasons for caring. "Looking for the Mercer place," the man said. "You found it," Colton said. "Looking specifically for a woman named Elena Cross." He glanced at the house. "Heard she might be here." Colton had gone through a full winter and half a year with Elena by that point, and he developed a specific sensitivity to certain categories of information. Something in the way this man said her name, the particular careful neutrality of it, put him in a different kind of attention. "My wife's name is Elena Mercer," Colton said. The man adjusted. "Cross before, though, before she married you." "What's your business with her?" "My name is Russell Vane." He stayed on the horse, which Colton noted. A man who stays on his horse when he's announced himself is a man keeping his options arranged for a quick departure. "I was a deputy a few years back over in Calhoun County, Dakota Territory. I've been looking for Elena Cross going on 3 years. Colton looked at him for a moment. "Get down," he said. "We'll talk on the porch." He didn't get Elena right away. He put Vane on the porch with a cup of coffee, and he went inside and he told Elena there was a man outside who'd come asking for her, and he gave her Vane's name, and he watched her face. What happened to her face was complicated and quick, and she got it under control fast. But he saw it. He saw the moment before she got it under control. "I know that name," she said. "I thought you might." She was standing at the kitchen table. Thomas was pulling himself up against her leg with great focus, unaware of anything. She looked down at him for a moment. "All right," she said. She straightened up. "I'll talk to him." "Elena, you don't have to do it right now. If I don't do it now, I'll have to do it later, and I don't want to do it later." She bent and picked Thomas up, settled him against her good arm. "I'd rather have him with me." He didn't argue with that either. They sat on the porch, Vane across from them, Colton beside Elena, Thomas in Elena's lap engaged in a close study of a button on her coat. Vane had the decency to set his coffee down and sit straight when they came out. He looked at Elena with the expression of a man who had practiced what he wanted to say and was now recalibrating against the reality of the woman in front of him. "You look well," he said. "Mr. Vane," Elena said. "Whatever you've come to say it plainly." He nodded. 4 years ago, Carson Whitfield died in Calhoun County. You knew him." "I was married to him." The word landed on the porch and stayed there for a moment. Colton's hands were still on the arms of his chair. He kept them still. "The official finding was accident," Vane said. "Fall from a horse. But the timing was questioned. You left Calhoun County 2 days after he died." I left because I had no reason to stay and several reasons not to. Some people thought those reasons might include the fact that the fall wasn't accidental. Elena looked at him directly. Her face was the controlled face, neutral, watchful. But under it, Colton could see something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. Something older than either. "What do you think?" she said. Vane was quiet for a moment. "I think it's a question I've been trying to get a straight answer to for 3 years. I think the people who were most vocal about their suspicions were people who had reasons of their own for pointing the finger somewhere else." He paused. "I think Carson Whitfield was a man with a particular kind of character that doesn't usually announce itself in public, but is known well enough by the people in a household." Elena said nothing. "I also think," Vane continued, "that I spoke to your sister." The controlled face didn't break, but something behind it did. Not in a visible way, more like a shift in the quality of stillness. "Clara," Elena said. It came out quieter than her other words. "Clara Drummond now, married 3 years, 2 children, living outside of Bismarck." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, which he set on the porch rail between them. "She wrote that down for me to give to you. She didn't know if I'd find you. She said to tell you she's been looking the same as me, but for different reasons." Elena looked at the paper. She didn't pick it up. "What happened?" Colton said. Not to Vane, to Elena. She looked at him. Her eyes were steady, but they were working, in the way they worked when she was deciding how far to go with something. Carson was... She stopped, started again. He was particular about certain things, about the way the house ran, about what he thought he was owed. She looked out at the yard. Clara came to stay with us the spring before he died. She was 16. She'd had trouble at home. Our father was a particular kind of man himself, and I thought it would be better with me. A pause. It wasn't. Carson decided that what was in our house was his to do with as he chose. The porch was very quiet. Even Thomas seemed to feel the quality of the silence. He'd stopped his examination of the button and was sitting still against Elena. "He came to Clara's room one night," Elena said. "I found out because she told me. And the next night, when he was..." She paused again. The pause was deliberate, controlled. "I was there. I got between them. We struggled on the stairs. He fell." She finally looked back at Colton. "He fell. I didn't push him. I was holding him back from Clara, and we were on the stairs and he lost his footing." She said it plainly, without dramatic weight, which made it hit harder than dramatic weight would have. "He fell down 12 stairs and broke his neck, and he was dead before I got to him." Colton held her gaze. He didn't look away, and he didn't change his expression, because what she needed from him in this moment was steadiness, not reaction. "Clara saw it," Elena said. "She was at the top of the stairs. She saw all of it." Vane, who had been listening without moving, said quietly, "That matches what she told me." Elena looked at him. "Then what did you come here for?" "To close it," Vane said. "I was a deputy when it happened. I never believed the accident story, but I couldn't get anyone to look at it properly. And when you left, I couldn't find you. I needed to hear your account." He leaned forward slightly. "And I needed to tell you that as far as I'm concerned, and as far as the record I'm filing will say, Carson Whitfield died by misadventure on his own staircase." "Which is the truth." The silence on the porch stretched out. "You came 3 years to tell me that," Elena said. "I came 3 years to make sure I had the right story," Vane said. "I have it now." Elena looked at the folded piece of paper on the porch rail. She reached out and picked it up with her bandaged hand, slowly, and held it. "Clara's well?" she said. "She seemed well. She's got a stubborn streak." Vane said the last part with a slight inflection that might have been the beginning of a dry smile. "Reminded me of someone." Elena didn't smile. But something in her loosened, the particular way of someone setting down a weight they'd been carrying so long, they'd stopped noticing it. Vane stayed for dinner because, by the time their conversation had finished, it was late enough that sending a man back into the coming dark seemed unnecessary. He was quiet at the table, not uncomfortable, just a man who listened more than he talked and had clearly been this way his whole life. He watched Thomas with the look that men had when they were assessing children without quite knowing they were doing it. "You've got a good setup here," he said to Colton, looking around the kitchen. "Getting there," Colton said. Better than getting there, Vane said. He looked at Elena. You landed somewhere worth landing. She was looking at Clara's letter, which she'd opened at the table and read and folded again and set beside her plate. I had help, she said. Colton didn't say anything to that. He refilled Vane's coffee. The night after Vane left, which was a night of ordinary quiet with the first real bite of autumn in the air and the stars very sharp and close. The way they got at that altitude, when the cold settled, Elena came to find him in the barn where he was making the last check of the night. She stood in the doorway with a lantern, and he turned when he heard her. You didn't ask me, she said. No, he said. You didn't ask me if it was the way I said. It was the way you said. He went back to checking the water trough. I don't need to ask. She came into the barn and set the lantern on the post. Colton. He stopped and looked at her. I need you to know, she said, that I have been in this house, in this life, thinking every morning might be the morning that something from before came through the door and took it away. Every morning for almost a year. Her voice was even, but it was the evenness of effort. I kept waiting for you to find a reason, because men find reasons. That's been my experience of men. He stood in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around him and looked at his wife. I'm not every man you've known, he said. I know that's not a particularly useful thing to say, but it's what's true. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not quite the softening he might have hoped for, because Elena didn't soften easily, but something adjacent, something more honest than softness. I know that, she said. I've known that for a while. I just needed to say the other thing out loud to someone. All right, he said. I heard it. She picked up the lantern. The burn is less. Good. Whitmore's ointment is better than I expected. I'll tell him you said so. It'll be the best day of his professional life. That got her, not a laugh, but a sharp exhale through her nose that was Elena's version of one, and she shook her head and turned back toward the house. He followed her through the dark yard with the stars overhead, and the first real smell of autumn cold coming in from the north. And when they got to the door, she stopped and checked the lock. And then she looked at the lock for a moment like she was seeing it differently, and then she pushed the door open and went inside. She didn't recheck it. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. October came in cool and fast, and the barn repair was finally complete. Pete Gallagher having turned out to be a harder worker than his age suggested, and the southeast corner now being structurally sounder than any other section of the roof. Elena's hand healed with the scar Whitmore had predicted, a pale, irregular mark across the meat of the palm that she would carry for the rest of her life. But it healed with full function, which was what mattered. She wrote to Clara in late September. The letter took her several evenings to finish, which he knew because she wrote it at the kitchen table after Thomas was down. And some evenings she wrote, and some evenings she just sat with the paper in front of her without writing, and he didn't ask about it, and eventually it got finished and he took it to the post himself. The news about Vane's visit had gotten around the settlement as news did. The specific details were less certain. Settlements ran on information, but information degraded over distance and repetition. But what people understood was that something from Elena's past had arrived and been resolved, and that the resolution had apparently been in her favor, and that the man who'd brought it had left without causing any trouble. This changed things in the way that only a specific kind of public accounting could change things. People who had built their version of Elena on the assumption that she was hiding something worth hiding had to do the quiet internal work of revising that version, which most of them did without announcement, and none of them did as quickly as might have been ideal. But Mrs. Harwick nodded to Elena in the street the following week, which was more than she'd done before. And Haverfield at the feed store told Colton, with the specific careful phrasing of a man making an indirect apology, that he thought the Mercer spread was shaping up to be one of the better operations in the county. And Bess Gallagher came over on a Saturday and stayed for 3 hours and left with one of Elena's bean seedling starters and the recipe for the particular winter stew that Elena had developed over the course of several months of experimentation, and told Elena on the way out that she thought Clara was lucky to have a sister like her. Elena stood in the doorway after Bess left and watched her go down the road, and her face was doing something that she didn't try to control. Colton, coming up from the barn, stopped when he saw her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was slightly off. I'm all right. He came and stood beside her, and they watched Bess's figure get smaller down the road. She told me Clara was lucky, Elena said. She's right. Elena was quiet for a moment. I never thought about it that way. Being someone worth being lucky to have. He didn't answer that immediately. He thought about what to say, and then said what was true. You've been that your whole life. You just didn't have anyone telling you. She looked at him. Her face was still doing the thing she wasn't controlling. You're better at this than you think you are, she said. Don't tell anyone, he said. I have a reputation for being difficult. She did laugh this time. The real version, short and real, and it startled a crow off the fence post where Aldous usually sat, and the crow made its displeasure known, and Thomas, who had been crawling near Colton's feet having apparently escaped from somewhere inside, looked up at the crow with fascinated attention, and then looked at Elena laughing and smiled the enormous, unselfconscious smile of a child who doesn't need to know why something is happy in order to join it. It was October in Montana, and the cold was coming, and there was still more work than there were hours in the day to do it, and Clara's letter was sitting unanswered on Elena's side of the kitchen, and her hand still ached on cold mornings, and Colton still sometimes stood in the kitchen at 2 a.m. and felt the particular shape of everything he'd lost. But Thomas was smiling at his mother in the doorway, and the crow was settling back on the fence post with ruffled dignity, and the afternoon was going gold through the cottonwoods along the fence line. Some days that was enough. Some days it was more than enough. Clara's letter arrived in November, not a response to Elena's, so the timing was too close for that. The mail between Montana Territory and the outskirts of Bismarck, moving at the pace that mail moved in 1872, which was the pace of horses and weather and the particular indifference of distance. It had been written before Vane's visit, before Elena had known there was anything to write back to, and it had been in transit through the postal relay at Fort Benton for 3 weeks before it finally made it to the settlement and from there to the Mercer Ranch. Colton brought it in from the post on a Tuesday and set it on the table without comment and went back to the barn, because he understood that some things required privacy to open. When he came back an hour later, Elena was sitting at the table with the letter in front of her, read and refolded, her unbandaged hand flat on the table beside it. Her face was the neutral face, but the quality of neutral was different, not the controlled kind, the kind that held things back, more like someone who had received information that required them to adjust the whole internal arrangement of something. She's coming, Elena said. Colton sat down. When? Spring. She and her husband and their children. Elena looked at the letter. She said she's been trying to find me for 2 years. She said, she paused. She said she's been carrying it. What happened? She said she needs to see me in person before she can put it down. He didn't say anything immediately. He waited because Elena wasn't finished. She was 16, Elena said. She was 16 when I left, and I couldn't take her with me. Not the way things were, not the way I left. But I've thought about that every day for 4 years. She looked up at him. Every single day. She's coming in the spring, Colton said. Yes. Then she's coming, and she'll see what's here, and you'll have time. Elena looked at him with the expression she had when he said something that was simpler than she'd been making it, and the simplicity was the right thing. Yes, she said again, different inflection this time. She picked up the letter and folded it and went to put it with the other things she kept in the cedar box on the shelf. Thomas's first cloth toy, the paper from the circuit judge that made her a Mercer, and now this. Colton watched her put it away and didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. Gib. November deepened into the specific gray and cold that Montana did before the real winter arrived. The sky low and colorless for weeks at a time, and the days short enough that they were working in partial dark at both ends. The cattle had been moved to the winter pasture, closer to the barn and the windbreaks, and the hay stores were holding well. Better than well, Elena's accounting from the summer having anticipated the usage rate accurately enough that Colton had adjusted his estimates upward. Thomas turned 1 year old that month. He was walking by then, the unsteady, broad-footed walk of children who had recently discovered that being vertical was an option, and he moved through the house with the absolute confidence of someone who had made a study of the obstacles and considered none of them to be serious problems. He had 4 teeth and opinions about food, and a specific relationship with Aldous the fox that had evolved over the summer into something Colton couldn't fully categorize. The fox came to the yard most mornings now, sat on its post, and Thomas would stand at the window and address it at length in the half-language that was developing into something that would be words eventually but wasn't quite yet. "He's telling it about his day," Elena said one morning, watching this exchange. "He's barely had a day. It's 7 in the morning. He's efficient." Colton looked at his son's back, the small shoulders moving with the energy of whatever he was communicating to the fox. The fox, for its part, listened with its characteristic air of restrained judgment. "He's going to be a talker," Colton said, "unlike both of us." "Compensation," Elena said, and went back to the stove. The winter came in properly by December, and with it the particular quality of isolation that frontier winters produced, not the desperate isolation of the previous year, the year of Agnes's death and Pickett's death, and the sense of a world actively contracting, but the ordinary isolation of a household turned inward, dependent on its own resources, finding the shape of its own rhythms without outside reference. They were not bad rhythms. Evenings by the fire, Thomas asleep in the back room, and the house quiet. Elena with her mending or her ledgers, and Colton with the harness repair or the wood carving he'd taken up in the winter months as a way to keep his hands occupied during the hours when there was nothing outside to be done. He'd started carving things for Thomas. Small animals, simply made, a horse and a dog, and what was intended to be a fox but came out looking more like a squirrel, which Thomas called the fox anyway with total conviction. They talked more in winter. That was something he'd noticed. The enforced proximity of a cold Montana winter, the way it narrowed the world to the house and the barn, and the short distances between them, had a way of requiring conversation that the busy seasons didn't. In summer, there was always something to move to, some task that needed 2 people in different places. In winter, they were in the same room most of the evening, and the silence, while not uncomfortable, had a way of developing gaps that eventually got filled. He learned things about her in that winter that the previous months hadn't produced. That she'd taught herself to read from her mother's Bible, not the religion, just the text, because it was the only book in the house for her first 12 years. That she'd worked accounts at a dry goods store for 2 years before marrying Whitfield at 19, thinking she was making a practical decision, which she had been, but practical decisions in the absence of adequate information were still mistakes. That she had a specific and detailed contempt for inefficiency that she'd inherited from her mother, who had run a household of 7 on almost nothing for 20 years and had never wasted a thing in her life. He told her things too. About the 7 years he'd spent building the Mercer spread from a single modest claim, the years before Agnes, when he'd been so focused on the work that he'd barely noticed the seasons turning. About his father, who had been a hard man but not an unkind one, which was a distinction that Colton had spent a long time learning to make. About the month after Agnes died, when he'd stood in this kitchen at 3 in the morning, looking at Thomas in his crib, and had felt something so close to nothing that it had frightened him more than the grief had. Elena listened to this last part without looking away from her mending, and when he finished, she said, "That feeling doesn't mean what you're afraid it means." "What does it mean?" "It means you were empty. People don't know how to be empty. They think it means they're broken." She looked up. "It means there was room." He sat with that for a moment. "Room for what?" he said, though he thought he knew. "For what came next," she said, and went back to her mending. The bad storm arrived on the 14th of January. Not a surprise exactly. The sky had been doing something for 2 days that Colton and Elena had both been watching. The particular layering of clouds that in Montana often preceded the worst of what the season had to offer. They'd prepared as thoroughly as preparation was possible. Cattle checked and moved tight against the south windbreak. Hay brought from the upper barn to the lower. The house stocked with enough wood to last a week, the water barrels filled. What they hadn't prepared for was the Noonan boy. His name was Eli Noonan. He was 8 years old, the youngest child of a farming family whose claim was 4 miles northwest, and he was the kind of child that communities produced in those years. Self-sufficient past what was reasonable for his age, accustomed to being useful, trusted with tasks that would horrify people a generation later. His father had sent him to the Gallagher place the morning before the storm arrived fully, carrying a message about a borrowed piece of equipment that needed to be arranged before winter made the errand impossible. He never reached the Gallaghers. Bess Gallagher came to the Mercer place in the early afternoon, fighting the leading edge of the storm, on horseback. Her face when Elena opened the door told the story before she said anything. "The Noonan boy," Bess said. "He never arrived. Mac went partway toward their place and there's no sign of him on the road. The storm's going to be full in an hour." Elena was already looking at Colton. "The old Hartley cabin," Colton said. "If he got disoriented, he might have found it. It's about 2 miles northwest of the road." "Or he might be in the open," Bess said. The way she said it meant what it meant. Colton reached for his coat. "I'm coming," Elena said. "Elena, I know that country better than you do. I've been riding it since October." She was already at the hook where her barn coat hung. "You take the road. I take the cutoff through the dry creek bed. We cover more ground that way." He wanted to argue. He looked at her face and recognized the specific expression that meant the argument was already over. "Stay in calling distance," he said. "If the snow comes full down before we find him, you turn back. Do you hear me?" "I hear you," she said, which was not the same as agreeing, and they both knew it. Bess took Thomas. She didn't ask. She just picked him up with the authority of a woman who had raised 5 children and held out her arms, and Thomas went to her without protest, because Thomas at 13 months had developed the reasonably sound policy of trusting large-hearted people who held him with confidence. The storm hit full within 40 minutes of them leaving the house, which was faster than Colton had estimated and fast enough to turn a bad situation into something worse. He took the road northwest, bending against the wind with his horse's head down and his eyes on the ground ahead. The snow was the horizontal kind, the kind that eliminated distance and context and made the familiar land into something abstract and slightly treacherous. He called the boy's name at intervals, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Nothing. He reached the point where the road turned and the Hartley cabin cutoff would be 1/2 a mile east, and he stopped. If the boy had left the road, if he'd gotten turned around, which was what happened to people in this kind of whiteout, even people who knew the land, there were 3 directions he might have gone. The cabin cutoff was one. The dry creek bed that ran northeast was another. The open pasture to the west was the one Colton didn't want to think about. He turned east toward the cabin. Elena had taken the creek bed route at a pace that was faster than sensible for the conditions, because the conditions didn't permit the pace that was sensible, and the boy had been out in this for at minimum 2 hours before anyone knew he was missing. She knew the creek bed because she'd ridden it 4 times in the fall, checking the fence line on the northwest boundary of the Mercer property. She knew where it widened into the flat area before the old Hartley property, and she knew where the ground got soft near the upper bend, and the horses sometimes went sideways on it, and she knew the shape of the cottonwoods that stood at the entrance to the Hartley claim, even with snow on them, because she'd made it her business to know the landscape she lived in. What she didn't know was whether an 8-year-old boy who'd gotten turned around in a blizzard would have had the navigation instincts to find the cabin. Children sometimes did and sometimes didn't. It depended on the child. She found his tracks about a 1/4 mile from the Hartley property. Partial impressions in the snow, already being erased but still readable to someone looking for them. Small boot prints. Moving in the right direction, roughly, though with the wandering quality of someone who was going by feel rather than sight. She followed them at a canter. The Hartley cabin had been abandoned for 6 years. The Hartley family had come to Montana with ambitions that the land hadn't matched, and had left without ceremony, leaving behind a 1-room structure that had been built solidly enough to still be standing, but that had been accumulating the small damages of 6 unattended winters since then. The door hung wrong on its hinges. The window on the north side had lost its oil paper covering. The roof, as far as Elena knew from one previous passing glance, had gaps. She saw the smoke before she saw the cabin. It was a thin thread of it coming from the chimney, the kind you made when you didn't have much to burn, and it was the best thing she'd seen all day. She got down from her horse and went to the door, which she had to lift slightly to open on its bad hinges, and inside on the dirt floor in front of a very small fire built from scraps of broken furniture was Eli Noonan. He was 8 years old, and he had a sharp-featured, serious face, and he looked up at her with the expression of someone who had been working very hard at not being scared and was now finding that the arrival of a known adult had made the Not Scared project considerably more difficult to maintain. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. His voice was controlled but thin. "Eli." She came and crouched in front of him. He was cold. She could see it in the color of his hands and the set of his shoulders. But he was alert, and his color was reasonable. "How long have you been here?" "Maybe 3 hours, I think." He looked at the fire. "I didn't have much to burn. I was trying to make it last." She looked at the fire and at what he'd used to build it. 2 broken chair legs, a piece of door frame, and what had been a window shutter. Smart choices, all of them. The boy had come into an abandoned building in a blizzard and assessed what he had and made decisions. "You did well," she said, meaning it. Something in his face moved, the first crack in the composure he'd been holding. "My father's going to be worried," he said. "Your father's going to be very glad to see you," she said. "Can you walk?" "Yes." He got up to prove it. His legs were stiff but holding. She looked at the fire. She looked at the roof. There were gaps she hadn't been able to see from outside, and one of them was directly above the left side of the cabin, where a piece of the ceiling beam had come partially down, aged and dry and close enough to the fire's heat that she understood immediately why leaving was the better choice over waiting. "Come on," she said. "My horse is outside." Chuck. She had him mounted in front of her and was 300 yards from the cabin when she heard it. The low crack and then the rush of collapse. The sound of a structure that had been holding on for 6 years, finally deciding it was done. She didn't look back. She kept the horse moving, Eli held against her with one arm, her face bent against the snow. She found Colton on the road about a mile south. He was coming toward her through the white, and she saw him see her, saw the specific way his body changed when he registered that she was there and that she had the boy. He pulled up beside them. He looked at Eli, a quick top-to-bottom assessment. "You all right?" he said to the boy. "Yes, sir," Eli said. He was shaking, but steadily, which was better than the alternative. Colton looked at Elena. His face was doing the thing it did when he was feeling something he wasn't going to say in front of other people. "Cabin?" he said. "Gone," she said. "The roof came in about 5 minutes after we left." He held her gaze for a moment. "Let's get him home," he said. The Noonan farm was another mile past the road junction, and they made it in the worst part of the storm, the 4 horses blowing hard and the snow coming sideways, and Eli Noonan holding on to the saddle with the focused determination of a child who had decided that holding on was his primary job, and he was going to do it well. Hattie Noonan came out of the house before they were fully stopped in the yard. She was a tall, angular woman who Colton had spoken to maybe 4 times, and whatever composure she'd been maintaining through the hours of not knowing came apart completely when she saw her son on Elena's horse. She pulled him down and held him with the complete physical commitment of a mother who has been very afraid, and Eli, who had been holding himself together for what Elena estimated was 4 hours of genuine danger, finally cried, quietly and briefly, against his mother's coat. Elena stayed on her horse. She looked at the scene and she was very still. Hattie Noonan looked up at her over her son's head. There were things in Hattie Noonan's face that were difficult to look at directly. Relief and fear, and the particular raw openness of someone who has just learned what almost happened. "He was in the old Hartley cabin," Elena said. "He built a fire. He was smart about it." Hattie couldn't speak for a moment. She pressed her face against Eli's hair. "Come inside," she managed, finally. "Both of you. Come inside." Word traveled, as it always did, but this time it traveled differently. The shape of the story that moved through the settlement in the days after was not the shape of a rumor or a judgment. It was the shape of a fact. The Noonan boy had been lost in the worst storm of the season, and Elena Mercer had found him, and the cabin they'd been in had come down shortly after they left it. Colton heard the story in 4 different versions over the following 2 weeks, and they all had the same architecture. Elena, alone, in the blizzard, finding the child and getting him out. Some versions were more dramatic than was strictly accurate. None of them were unkind. Mrs. Harwick stopped Elena outside the dry goods store on a Thursday in late January and spoke to her for 10 minutes, which Colton witnessed from across the street. He couldn't hear what was said. He could see Elena's face, the neutral face, the listening face, and he could see Mrs. Harwick's, which was doing something he hadn't seen it do before in Elena's presence. At the end of the conversation, Mrs. Harwick put her hand out, and Elena shook it, and Mrs. Harwick went into the store, and Elena came across the street to where Colton was standing. Well, he said. She said she'd been wrong, Elena said. Her voice was even. About her initial concerns, about a number of things. A pause. She was gracious about it, actually. I'll give her that. People come around, Colton said, slowly. Slower than I'd like, Elena said. But yes. Haverfield gave her a 10% reduction on the spring seed order without being asked. Polly Rudd, whose son had been making Elena's life difficult in the street for most of the previous year, came to the ranch on a Saturday with a jar of preserves and a speech that was clearly prepared and clearly difficult and clearly genuine. And Elena accepted all three of these things with the specific grace of someone who understood what a hard thing was costing the person doing it. Cade Rudd himself. She didn't see until February in the feed store, and when she came in, he went very still in the way that 17-year-olds went still when they had done something they couldn't undo and were now in the same room as the person they'd done it to. Elena bought what she came to buy, and when she was leaving, she stopped and looked at him directly for the first time in months. You ever want to know what work looks like? She said. Come out to the Mercer place. We usually have something that needs doing. She left. Cade stood in the feed store looking at the door she'd gone through. He showed up 3 weeks later. He didn't say much. He worked a full day on the fence line on the west pasture and did it correctly and without being told twice about anything. Elena fed him dinner and sent him home. He came back the following Saturday. Quote, the community meeting happened in late February at the settlement's general meeting house, the kind of gathering that occurred 2 or 3 times a year to handle collective matters. The distribution of the county road maintenance funds, the organization of the spring market, the various small administrative items that required more than one family's input. Colton and Elena went together, which was itself a thing that would not have happened the previous year. Elena had avoided these gatherings, and he hadn't pushed it, understanding that she was in the process of finding out how welcome she was, and that forcing the question before it was ready didn't help. But February was different. February was after the storm, and after Eli Noonan, and after a winter's worth of small daily accumulated evidence of what the Mercer place was, and who ran it. They sat in the third row, Thomas on Elena's lap, because Bess Gallagher, who usually took him for these things, had a cough she was managing. Colton sat beside Elena with his arm along the back of her chair in the way he'd unconsciously started doing in public. Not possessively, just adjacently, the natural proximity of two people who had grown used to being in the same space. It was Hattie Noonan who spoke first, in a break between agenda items, in the slightly formal way of someone who had decided to say something and had been holding it in reserve until the moment was right. I want to say something about Elena Mercer, she said from the second row. The meeting room went quiet. These silences had a quality to them, the texture of people paying a specific kind of attention. My son, Hattie said, her voice was steady but working at it, is alive because that woman went into a blizzard alone to find him. I know there were people in this room who had opinions about her when she first came here. I had opinions myself. I want to go on record that I was wrong, and I think others were too, and I think it's worth saying out loud in front of everyone rather than just in private where it's easier. The silence after that was different. Fuller. Mac Gallagher said from across the room. She fixed my fence line. It was Mac's version of an endorsement, which everyone who knew Mac understood. Someone else, one of the older farmers, a man named Cresswell, who hadn't said much to anyone about anything in the time Elena had been in the settlement, said that the Mercer spread was the best-run operation in the county, and that the people running it were the kind of neighbors worth having. It was not a dramatic moment in the way that dramatic moments were supposed to be. Nobody made speeches. Nobody wept. People said what they had to say, and then the meeting moved on to the spring market organization and the road funds, and it was all very ordinary. But Colton felt Elena's hand find his under the armrest of her chair, and he turned his palm over and she held on, and Thomas sat between them regarding the assembled community with his dark, serious eyes as though taking notes. March came, and with it the loosening of winter, and with it the letter from Clara confirming the date of her arrival, the 3rd week of April, by stage to Fort Benton, and then whatever arrangement could be made from there. Elena read the letter at the kitchen table, and then she read it again. She's bringing both children, she said. The oldest is 3. The baby is 8 months. We'll make room, Colton said. Elena looked at him. You haven't met her. No. She's... Elena paused. She's a lot. She fills a room. She's nothing like me. I'll survive, Colton said. Elena put the letter down. She was doing the things she sometimes did when she was feeling something that didn't have a ready category. Looking at a fixed point, not blanked out, but moving through something internally. It's been 4 years, she said. I know. I left her when she was 16. She said it flatly, without excusing it, without dramatic self-condemnation either. Just the fact of it, the weight she'd been carrying since September. She wrote you twice, Colton said. She's coming in April. She sent you the letter to give her address. Elena was quiet. People leave because they have to, he said. And then sometimes they can come back. That's what's happening. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's just what it is. He looked at her. You've been carrying guilt about a 16-year-old girl who is now a 20-year-old woman with a husband and 2 children who is traveling 3 states to see you. Let her get here before you decide how you're supposed to feel about it. Elena looked at him for a moment with the expression that meant he'd said something that landed correctly, even if she wasn't ready to say so. Thomas, who had been walking laps around the kitchen table in the focused way he had of conducting locomotion practice, chose this moment to arrive at Elena's chair and grab her sleeve and pull himself upright against it and stand there looking up at her with enormous satisfaction. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. Mama, he said, clear as anything. His 4th real word, following Dada and Fox and more, and he said it with the complete confidence of someone to whom the word had always been obvious. Elena went very still. Then she reached down and picked him up and held him against her and pressed her face against the top of his head. And Thomas, who had accomplished a thing and knew it, patted her shoulder with the generous benevolence of someone dispensing comfort. Colton sat at his kitchen table in the March cold, with the spring just starting to loosen the frost in the yard. And he watched his wife hold his son, and he understood that this moment, not the wedding, not the proposal, not the night in the blizzard when he'd found her and brought her back, this was the moment when the Mercer house became what it was always going to be. Not a house fixed by someone's arrival, not a grief recovered from, not a problem solved or a situation managed, just a home. The ordinary, complicated, imperfect, ongoing fact of one. Part 5. Lưu ý chậm. Viết năm 1500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Phả hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột. Không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cắm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo. Phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng, nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dụng giữa câu, hãy viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh, không mở rộng nội dung. Thoughts show for more. Claire Drummond arrived on the 22nd of April, 3 days later than her letter had estimated, because the stage from Fort Benton had thrown a wheel outside of a relay station, and the replacement had taken longer than anyone wanted. Elena had been watching the road since morning. Colton watched her watch it, from the barn, from the yard, from the kitchen window where she stood with her coffee going cold in her hand and her eyes on the track that led from the settlement road to the ranch gate. She didn't say anything about it. She'd been not saying anything about it for 3 weeks, since the confirmation letter, in the specific way she had of carrying things without putting them down or asking for help with them. He didn't push. He'd learned by now that pushing Elena towards something she wasn't ready to arrive at on her own terms produced nothing useful. Thomas was in the yard when the wagon came through the gate, toddling in the particular wide-legged, determined way of children who had recently mastered walking and were now field testing its applications. He stopped when he saw the wagon. He looked at it with the serious, evaluating expression that was his default response to new information. Elena came off the porch before the wagon had fully stopped. The woman who got down from the wagon was not what Colton had expected, though he realized afterward that he hadn't had a clear picture of what he'd expected. Clara Drummond was 20 years old, and she was taller than Elena by 2 inches, and she had the same dark hair but worn loose, and she moved with a kind of energy that was different from her sister's. Not controlled and precise, but immediate, the energy of someone who reacted first and organized the reaction afterward. She saw Elena and stopped moving for about half a second. Then she crossed the distance between them in 4 strides and put her arms around her sister, and Elena stood in the yard and held on, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Colton picked Thomas up and kept his distance. This was not a moment that needed witnesses. This was a moment that needed to be what it was. Clara's husband was a broad-shouldered, quiet man named James Drummond, who shook Colton's hand with the grip of someone who worked with his hands and looked at the ranch with the eyes of someone who knew what he was looking at. Their older child, a girl of 3 named May, got down from the wagon and immediately investigated Thomas with the focused intensity of a child conducting a peer assessment. Thomas submitted to this examination with reasonable equanimity. The baby, 8 months, round-faced, deeply unimpressed by the journey, was handed to Colton by James with the practicality of a man who had been carrying an infant for several days and was glad to distribute the weight. Colton, who by now had considerable experience with infants, held her in the particular way that worked, and she looked up at him and considered him and apparently decided he was acceptable because she stopped fussing. "She doesn't usually do that," James said, with the slightly surprised expression of a father who had been fussed at for several hundred miles. "Thomas was the same way," Colton said. "You just have to hold them like they're a person, not like they're something fragile." James looked at him and then nodded, slowly, the way a man nodded when he was filing something away. That first evening was not easy, and Colton hadn't expected it to be. The house was fuller than it had ever been. 2 extra adults, 2 children, the logistics of feeding everyone and finding sleep arrangements and negotiating the kitchen, which was Elena's territory in a way that required adjustment for 2 women who had been living separately for 4 years and had no established domestic grammar between them. Clara talked constantly, which Elena had warned him about, and which was accurate. She talked through dinner and through the clearing up after and through the putting of children to bed. A running commentary on the journey, on James's family in Bismarck, on the spring, on the baby's sleep patterns, on 17 other subjects. James interjected occasionally with the practiced timing of a man who had learned exactly where the gaps were. Elena listened and responded in the shorter, more measured way that was hers, and Colton watched the 2 of them recalibrate to each other across the table with the specific attention he'd gotten good at paying to things that mattered. It was after the children were down, and James had excused himself with the diplomacy of a man who understood when his presence was not required, that the 2 sisters sat at the kitchen table alone. Colton was nominally doing something with a harness repair in the corner of the room, and he was actually doing that, but he was also there, and Elena hadn't asked him to leave, which he took to mean his presence was acceptable. Clara had gone quiet. The talking had stopped the way a wind stops, completely, and the silence after it had a different quality than the talking had. "I should have found a way to take you with me," Elena said. She said it to the table, not dressed up, not preambled, just the thing she'd been carrying since September of 4 years ago, finally set down in a room that could hold it. Clara looked at her. "You couldn't have." "I didn't try hard enough." "Elena." Clara's voice had lost its relentless energy. What was under it was something older and more tired. "You were 20 years old and you just watched your husband die, and you had $40 in a canvas bag. How exactly were you going to take a 16-year-old girl somewhere?" "I could have." "You couldn't." Clara reached across the table and put her hand over her sister's, over the scarred palm that the September fire had left. "I knew why you left. I understood it. I was 16, not 6. She paused. "What I didn't understand was whether you were all right. That's what I didn't know for 4 years." Elena was quiet. "Are you?" Clara said. "All right." Elena looked at her sister and then at the room around her. The kitchen, with its seasoned cast iron and its clay pots on the sill and the small wooden animals Thomas had lined up on the window seat that afternoon, and the harness in the corner where her husband sat pretending to work. "Yes," Elena said. It came out simpler and more certain than most things she said. Clara looked at the room too. She looked at Colton, who found something very interesting to do with the harness buckle. She looked back at Elena. "Good," she said. She squeezed her sister's hand and let go. "Then tell me everything, from the beginning. I want to hear all of it." And Elena, who did not generally tell things from the beginning to anyone, did. The Drummonds stayed 2 weeks. By the end of the first week, May and Thomas had established a functional, if occasionally contentious relationship based primarily on their shared interest in Aldous the fox and their divergent opinions about territorial rights to the wooden animals on the window seat. By the end of the second week, they had arrived at a working arrangement that seemed to suit both of them, which involved Thomas controlling the animals and May controlling the narrative of what the animals were doing, a division of authority that Thomas apparently found acceptable. James Drummond turned out to be, beneath the quiet, a man of considerable competence and specific opinions about land management. He and Colton spent 3 mornings looking at the Mercer spread with the eyes of 2 men who understood what a working ranch required. And what came out of those conversations was a plan for a drainage project on the northwest pasture that Colton had been vaguely aware of needing for 2 years and had never properly organized. James drew it out on paper with a precision that suggested he'd done this kind of planning before. "You should do this in May," James said, "before the ground gets hard again." "I know," Colton said. "I've been putting it off." "Why?" Colton looked at the drawing. "Too much else to do. Too much happening." James nodded. "Clara does that too. Knows what needs doing and keeps it at a distance because everything else is more immediate." He paused. "What usually works is just starting. First morning, don't plan it beyond the first step." It was simple advice and not new advice, but it was the right advice at the right moment, and Colton filed it. Elena and Clara, in those 2 weeks, did not resolve 4 years of distance in any neat or dramatic way. What they did was more ordinary and more durable. They relearned each other. Clara learned that her sister had become someone who got up at 5 and worked until dark, and could fix a fence and manage accounts, and had opinions about soil drainage. Elena learned that her sister had grown from a frightened 16-year-old into a woman who laughed loudly and loved specifically and had built something real in Bismarck with a quiet man and was fundamentally not, the girl who needed protecting anymore. That was the thing Elena had to understand, and that took the full 2 weeks to settle. That the person she'd been carrying guilt about protecting had stopped needing that particular protection somewhere along the way and had become someone who was, in most respects, doing fine. The night before the Drummonds left, Clara said, out of nowhere, while they were washing the dinner dishes, "He looks at you like you're the answer to a question he forgot he was asking." Elena didn't need to ask who she meant. "He's not demonstrative." "No, but he looks at you like that." Clara handed her a wet plate. "Some men are loud about it. His kind is quieter and it goes deeper. I'd take that over loud any day." Elena dried the plate. "Clara," she said. "What?" "Thank you for coming." Clara looked at her. "You're my sister. Where else would I go?" They saw the Drummonds off at the settlement road on a Thursday morning in early May. The sky going the particular pale blue of Montana springs when the weather was being cooperative, which was not always. Thomas waved at May from Colton's arms with the generous authority of someone who is mostly sorry to see the fox's secondary audience depart. May waved back with theatrical feeling. Elena stood at the road and watched the wagon until it rounded the bend and was gone, and then she stood there another moment. "She'll come back," Colton said. "I know." Elena turned from the road. "Or we'll go there." She said it like it was a fact she'd just confirmed, something that had been a question before and wasn't anymore. She picked up Thomas from Colton's arms and headed back toward the house. And Colton followed, and somewhere behind them, Aldous the fox reclaimed his post on the fence with the dignified efficiency of a creature resuming a job that had been temporarily inconvenienced. The spring of 1873 was when the ranch became something more than Colton had planned for it to be, though he couldn't have told you the exact moment it happened because it accumulated rather than arrived. It started, as most of what happened at the Mercer place started, with something practical. A family called Birch, husband, wife, 3 children under 10, had come through the settlement on their way to a claim in the Judith Basin and had run into the specific frontier arithmetic where everything that could go wrong with a wagon and a team in spring mud had gone wrong simultaneously. They had no money left, no working wheel, and a wife who had been fighting a chest infection for 2 weeks. Elena heard about it at the dry goods store on a Thursday and came home and told Colton about it. He looked at her. "How long do they need?" he said. "Until the wheel's fixed and she can travel without making the infection worse. 2 weeks? Maybe 3. He looked around the house, the yard, the barn, which had been repaired and was now the soundest structure on the property. "There's the spare room," he said. "The barn has the loft." "I know," Elena said. She was waiting, he understood, for his answer, even though both of them probably already knew what it was. "Bring them out," he said. The Birch family stayed 3 weeks. Marcus Birch, the husband, worked the ranch those 3 weeks with the desperate energy of a man who needed to pay his way and understood that work was the currency available to him. His wife, whose name was Ruth, recovered from the chest infection with Elena's management of the eucalyptus steam treatment and the particular broth that Bess Gallagher had taught Elena to make for lung ailments over the winter. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, became temporary extensions of the ranch's domestic population, absorbed into the daily routines without particular ceremony. Thomas thrived on the company. He was not quite 2, but he had the social instincts of someone older, already understanding that other children were interesting in a way that adults weren't quite, and he followed the Birch children around the yard with the devoted attention of someone taking notes on technique. When the Birches left, Ruth held Elena's hands and said something Colton didn't hear because he was loading their repaired wagon and was not close enough. But he saw Elena's face during it, and what he saw was not the controlled face or the neutral face. It was just her face, open in the way that faces were when people weren't managing their expression. After the Birches, there was a widow named Esther Vane, no relation to Russell, just the coincidence of a common name, who came through in July with her teenage daughter and no clear destination and very little of anything else. They stayed 6 weeks, and Esther Vane turned out to have a skill with horses that had no business existing in a woman who'd spent most of her life running a dry goods store in Nebraska. And she helped Colton with the fall roundup before she and her daughter moved on to a cousin's place near Helena. After Esther, there was a man traveling alone who had a dog and a broken arm and no money and who slept in the barn for 10 days while the arm was healing and never gave them more of his name than Porter, and who fixed the kitchen window latch on his way out without being asked, as a wordless accounting for what he'd received. And then word started to get around the way word got around in the way settlements had, moving from family to family and homestead to homestead and adding detail and losing other detail as it went. What the word said, in its various versions, was that the Mercer place would take you in if you needed it, that you'd work for what you got, but you'd get it, that the woman who ran the place had specific and non-negotiable standards about what working meant, and those standards were applied even-handedly, but that if you were in genuine need, there was room. This was not a reputation Colton and Elena had sat down and decided to build. It was a reputation they had accidentally constructed by responding to specific situations as those situations arrived, and by the winter of 1873, it had a life of its own. But that winter, Cade Rudd came to work at the ranch full-time. He was 18 by then, and the months of Saturday work had produced something in him that was difficult to name precisely, but was visible in the way he moved around the ranch. Less with the self-conscious performance of a boy trying to establish something, and more with the straightforward purposefulness of someone who had found a context where they were useful. He was good with cattle in the patient particular way that couldn't be taught so much as noticed in a person. And Elena had noticed it and told Colton, and Colton had offered Cade the position of first ranch hand with a directness that Cade had received with the slightly stunned expression of someone who hadn't been expecting a door to be that open. "I said things," Cade said. He was looking at his boots in the particular way of 18-year-olds confronting their own record. "About Mrs. Mercer, last year." "I know what you said," Colton said. "I want to." "Say it to her," Colton said. "Not to me." Cade went and found Elena in the barn, and whatever passed between them in there, Colton wasn't party to. But Cade came out 20 minutes later with the particular posture of someone who had said a hard thing and had it received without being demolished by the reception. He started work the following Monday. Thomas turned 2 in November of that year and showed every sign of becoming the talker Elena had predicted. He had words for everything, including Aldous, who he called by name with the familiarity of long acquaintance, and he had developed the habit of narrating the day in a running commentary directed at whoever was nearest, which was sometimes Elena, and sometimes Colton, and sometimes Cade, and sometimes the fox. He also had, by 2, a clear and unself-conscious understanding of who his family was. He called Elena Mama with the same unconsidered ease that he called Colton Dada, the same ease with which he would eventually explain to other children that his mother had come in a snowstorm, which was his version of the story and would remain his version for the rest of his life. Colton watched him with Elena one afternoon in the kitchen, Thomas standing on a chair to reach the counter, Elena letting him participate in the bread making with the particular patience she had for teaching him things. The same steady narrating voice she'd used when he was an infant, now answered back by actual words and questions and the occasional strong opinion about procedure. "He's going to need more than we can teach him here," Elena said that evening, not as a worry, as a fact she was thinking forward toward. "There's the settlement school," Colton said. "By the time he's ready, I think there'll be something better." She was looking at the kitchen window, at the dark outside it. "I've been writing to the county board about it." He looked at her. "About what specifically?" "About the possibility of a schoolhouse that isn't the Harwick sitting room. About a proper teacher. About the fact that there are 11 children within 4 miles of this settlement who are being educated whenever someone has time and a Bible and calling it sufficient." She turned from the window. "It's not sufficient." "No," he agreed. "It's not. I made a case on paper. I laid out the numbers. Children, distances, current educational provision. I sent it to the county board in November." She paused. "Bess helped me with the formal language. She's better at formal language than I am." "Ma, when did all this happen?" "Over the past 3 months, mostly. You were busy with the drainage project." He sat with this for a moment. His wife had organized a campaign for a county schoolhouse while he was managing drainage. This was, he reflected, a fairly accurate portrait of how their household operated. "What did they say?" he said. "Nothing yet, but they will." She said it with the quiet certainty she applied to things she'd already decided were going to happen. "They'll say something by spring." Look, the county said something by February. What they said was not yes. It was a conditional maybe, contingent on community matching funds and a suitable location being proposed, and a formal petition with signatures. It was the specific bureaucratic language of an institution that wanted to be persuaded rather than simply comply. Elena treated this as an invitation. What followed over the next 4 months was the first organized community effort that the settlement had undertaken in recent memory, and it was organized in the way that things at the Mercer Ranch were organized, practically, without drama, with a focus on the concrete steps between the current situation and the desired outcome. Elena drafted the petition. Bess Gallagher circulated it. Colton and Marcus Birch, who had returned that spring, his wife recovered, his family looking for a place to land permanently, identified a location on the settlement's common land that met the county's specifications. Hattie Noonan contributed the matching funds campaign, going door to door with the particular tenacity of a woman who had learned via her son's rescue not to underestimate what collective effort could produce. Haverfield at the feed store gave the first donation. Mac Gallagher gave the second. Even old Cresswell, who had never in living memory opened his hand for anything communal, gave enough to matter. By June, they had the funds, the signatures, and the location. By August, the county had approved. By the following spring, there was a schoolhouse. Modest, 2 rooms, a wood stove, a proper school teacher brought in from Helena, standing on the settlement's common land. At the small gathering held when it opened, Hattie Noonan stood up and said that it had been Elena Mercer's idea and Elena Mercer's letters that had started the whole thing, and Elena, sitting in the 3rd row with Thomas on her lap, said that it had been a community effort, and she was one part of it, which was true, but also characteristically deflective. And Bess Gallagher from across the room, said loudly that it was Elena's effort and the community had followed, which was also true, and closer to the whole story. The seasons moved the way seasons moved in Montana, without sentiment, in their own time, demanding the full attention of the people living in them. Marcus and Ruth Birch took the claim south of the Mercer Ranch and became the neighbors on that side, the way Gallagher's were the neighbors on the east. Marcus's particular talent with horses and Colton's particular talent with cattle created a kind of informal partnership that worked better in practice than either of them had designed in theory. Their children grew up alongside Thomas in the way frontier children grew up, ranged across multiple properties, belonging to the broader community as much as to their individual families. Cade Rudd stayed. He was not the boy who'd said things in the street anymore, and the process by which he'd stopped being that boy was not dramatic and not linear, and involved more wrong turns than a cleaner story would allow. But he was good with the cattle, and he learned the ranch with the accumulating knowledge of someone intending to be there for a long time. And eventually Elena trusted him to manage the spring roundup with minimal oversight, which was not a trust she distributed lightly. Esther Vane came back, the widow with the horse skill, and stayed permanently, taking a small claim on the settlement's north edge and trading her horse knowledge for various forms of community assistance with the practical competence of a woman who had decided exactly what her life was going to look like and was building it accordingly. The fox, Aldous, who Thomas had named and whom the family had been referring to by name for 2 years now, much to Colton's continued nominal resistance, had established himself as a semi-permanent fixture in a way that foxes didn't generally do with human settlements. He was not tame. He would not be touched. But he was there most mornings on his post, conducting his judicial survey of the yard, and Thomas had grown up talking to him and had apparently passed this on to several of the Birch children who had also started addressing the fox by name. "We have a community fox," Elena said one morning. "We do not have a community fox," Colton said. "The Birch children call him by name." "That doesn't make him a community fox. That makes him a wild animal that people have decided is a community fox, which is different. The distinction is largely theoretical. The distinction is important," he said, but he was looking out at the fox on the post when he said it. Clara came back 3 more times before Thomas was 5, each visit easier than the last, each one building a grammar between the 2 sisters that the 4-year gap had interrupted, but not, it turned out, destroyed. James Drummond and Colton developed the kind of friendship that practical men developed, not intimate, not particularly verbal, but solid in the way of things built for use rather than appearance. May Drummond and Thomas Mercer grew up between 2 households, 2 territories, connected by the correspondence that Elena and Clara maintained across the 4 years of visits, letters traveling the distance between Montana and Bismarck, with the regularity of people who had learned not to let distance become disappearance. In the late fall of Thomas's 5th year, a reporter from a Helena newspaper came through the settlement writing a piece on frontier homesteading. He was a young man, earnest and slightly overwhelmed by the gap between what he'd read about frontier life and what it actually looked like. And he spent a day at the Mercer Ranch watching how things ran and asking questions of whoever would answer them. He asked Colton, at the end of the day, how he'd built what he'd built. He gestured at the ranch, the sound barn, the productive kitchen garden that had by now expanded to supply not just the Mercer household, but several others in the settlement. The cattle herd that had grown from 300 to nearly 450, the people moving through the yard with the purposeful ease of workers who knew their roles. Colton thought about it for a moment. "I didn't," he said, not alone. "I had help I didn't deserve and didn't know how to ask for." The reporter wrote that down. He asked Elena the same question, later finding her in the kitchen where she was going over the accounts with the focused precision that the accounts always received. "What made this work?" he asked. She looked up from the ledger. She looked at the question the way she looked at problems she was calculating, finding the correct entry point. "Need," she said. "We each needed something the other had. That's not romantic, but it's true. And we were both honest enough to admit it, eventually." She paused. "Most people in difficult situations lie about what they need because they're afraid of what it will cost them to ask. We got past that faster than most, not because we were particularly brave, because we didn't have the option of not getting past it." The reporter wrote that down too. He asked Colton, on his way out, one last question. He'd heard the story, the winter night, the woman in the snow, the way it had started. And he asked why Colton had gone back out after turning her away. Colton stood in the yard in the early dark of fall, the lights of the house behind him, the sound of Thomas's voice carrying from inside, explaining something to someone, his natural mode, and the distant shape of a fox on a fence post, barely visible. "She didn't ask me to save her," Colton said. "She asked for work. She wanted to carry her own weight." He paused. "I'd been sinking for months because I was too proud to admit I couldn't do it alone. She knocked on the door and told me exactly what she needed and what she could give in return, and there wasn't a single false thing in it." He looked at the house. "I think I went back out there because I recognized something, that what she had was the thing I was lacking, and that I was about to lose it to my own fear of trusting a stranger." He looked at the reporter. "She showed me," he said, "that the only way through the winter was to stop trying to do it by yourself." What the Mercer Ranch became, over the years that followed, was not a legend. Legends were clean and legends were finished, and the Mercer place was neither. What it was real. It was a working ranch that had bad years and good years and years that landed somewhere in the complicated middle. It was a household where two people who were not naturally demonstrative had built a language between them that said what it needed to say without requiring translation. It was a place where people in trouble knew they could come, not because it was perfect, and not because the people there had everything figured out, but because they had been through enough to know that what someone in trouble actually needed was not pity and not advice, but a practical hand and an honest accounting of what was available. Thomas grew up knowing this the way he knew his own name, not as a lesson told to him, but as the condition of his life. He grew up knowing that his mother had walked through a snowstorm with nowhere to go and had knocked on a door and asked for work instead of charity. He grew up knowing that what that meant was not that she had been saved, but that she had been brave enough to ask for what she actually needed, and that his father had been wise enough eventually to hear it. He told this story his whole life. He told it the way Elena would have told it, plainly, without embellishment, giving it the weight of a fact rather than the weight of a myth. The scar on Elena's hand faded over the years but didn't disappear. Whitmore had said it wouldn't, and he'd been right about that, as he was right about most things. She came to regard it the way she regarded the door lock she eventually stopped checking, a habit of the past that had left its mark but no longer controlled the present. Colton never became a man who spoke easily about what he felt, but he became a man who showed it with sufficient consistency that the people around him knew what he meant. That was its own kind of fluency. Elena understood it the way she understood the ranch's rhythms, learned over time, relied upon, trusted even on the days when it wasn't visible. There were hard years. There were years when the cattle prices were bad, and the winter was brutal, and the gap between what they'd built and what could still be lost was closer than comfort allowed. There was a year when Elena was sick for 6 weeks with a lung infection that frightened Colton in a way he didn't show, but that settled into him and stayed, the way fear of specific losses settled into a person who had already known that particular kind of loss. She recovered, which Whitmore said was due to her constitution, and which Elena said was due to not having the option of not recovering, and which Colton said nothing about because he was too busy being relieved. There were years when the good things were simply the ordinary good things. The cattle healthy, the accounts balanced, Thomas doing well in the schoolhouse that Elena had helped build, the kitchen garden coming up in its disciplined rows, Bess Gallagher at the kitchen table with her coffee and her opinions, Cade Rudd managing the spring roundup with the competence of a man who had grown into his work. And there were years when the extraordinary good things happened, Clara's visits, May, and Thomas tearing around the yard in the specific cooperative chaos of children who knew each other well, the fox on his post with his judicial authority, and the evenings that fell, the way fall evenings fell in Montana, going gold and long over the cottonwoods along the fence line. Belonging, Elena thought, on one of those evenings. Standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, watching Colton and Thomas in the yard. Thomas explaining something at considerable length, while his father listened with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered. Belonging was not a thing you were given. It was not a verdict pronounced on you by a community or a status confirmed by marriage, or something that arrived when you finally found the right place. It was a thing you built, in the specific way you built anything worth having, daily, imperfectly, by showing up when it would have been easier not to, By doing the work that needed doing even when nobody was watching, by asking for what you actually needed instead of pretending you needed nothing. She had knocked on a door in a blizzard and asked for work. She had not asked to be saved because being saved was not what she needed, and she had known the difference. That was the whole story, distilled. Everything else was the living of it, which was longer and harder and better than any distillation could hold. Thomas came running in from the yard at that point, loud with something he'd discovered, and Elena turned from the window to receive whatever it was with the full attention it would get, because that was what she did with the things that came to her, and that, in the end, was what had made all the difference.